All right. Well, let's get started, everyone. And thank you for joining us for Ontario Farmland Trust Winter Webinar. Today, we'll be providing you with an introduction to the farmland protection options that are available with OFT, and we are very pleased to have you all here today. My name is Megan Mills, and I'm a volunteer board member with the Ontario Farmland Trust. Also chair of the organization's Land Securement and Stewardship Committee, and when I'm not. So Ontario Farmland Trust works all across the province, but we are centered in Guelph on the treaty lands and the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit of the Anishinaabe peoples, the original and ongoing protectors of these lands. Guelph is located on the lands of Treaty 3, the Between the Lakes Purchase Territory. As settler nations work to reconcile relationships with Indigenous nations, we want our work at the Ontario Farmland Trust to reflect the respect that is deserved to the legacy of the land's original caretakers, whose generations of stewardship allow us to enjoy the beauty and bounty that we do today. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We do encourage you to share your comments in the chat during the presentation, but if you have questions to the presenters, please use the Q&A feature. If you have a similar question to one that's already been submitted, then you can use the upvote, which is click that thumbs up icon, and this will help to move the question up in the queue so that we're able to answer the most popular questions first. Tamara Brown, our volunteer and community engagement coordinator here at OFT, will be providing support during the webinar. So if you're having any technical issues, you can message them directly using that chat feature. So for those of you who are not familiar with OFT, we are the only provincial-wide land conservation organization with a mission dedicated to the protection and preservation of Ontario's agricultural landscapes. Ontario's prime agricultural land is finite. It's a non-renewable resource that comprises less than 5% of the provincial land base. Farmland is the literal foundation of the agri-food sector, and that sector in Ontario provides locally produced foods and employs more than 10% of the province's labor force. It also contributes over $47 billion annually to the provincial GDP. It's more important now than ever before that we protect our agricultural landscapes. Ontario has lost 20% of our farmland in the last 40 years, and the rate of farmland loss has nearly doubled between 2016 and 2021. According to StatsCan, we're losing farmland at a rate of more than 300 acres per day. Once farmland is developed, it's gone forever. So that sounds kind of bleak, but what do we do to help this situation? Well, we have three main areas of activity here at the Farmland Trust. Our primary activity is the permanent protection of farmland, and we do that by working with landowners who want to protect their properties for future development. We help them do this by placing farmland easement agreements on title to their land, or if they wish, they can donate their farm property to the Farmland Trust for stewardship. You will learn more about this in the webinar today. Through our public engagement and education programming, we educate people on the threats to farmland and how we can collectively work together to protect it. We also use our voice to comment on provincial policy that impacts farmland and to amplify the voices of organizations doing similar work. I am very happy to say that we OFT have permanently protected 22 properties, amounting to over 2,500 acres of farmland, forests, and wetlands. And we also have a number of other protection projects that are currently on the go. Today with us, we have Joel Enman and Martin Stradoff, who will be sharing their expertise. Joel is the Farmland Conservation Specialist at the Ontario Farmland Trust, and he has completed a Bachelor of Science and Honors in Zoology from the University of Guelph, and a Master's of Environment and Sustainability from the University of Western Ontario. He has experience in animal care, land conservation, agriculture, and environmental monitoring. Martin is the Executive Director of the Ontario Farmland Trust, and Martin comes from a farming background and is currently in the process of finishing his master's degree in rural planning and development at the University of Guelph. We hope that this session will give those of you joining us today, an introduction to the work of land trusts and options for landowners to protect their farmland and its ecological features. And I am now going to turn things over to Joel.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Joel, and thank you for joining us today. My work background includes many different roles pertaining to animal care, including zookeeping, veterinary work, and others, but my first job in agriculture was actually working as a farmhand on a goat farm in Newtonville, Ontario, for anybody who's familiar with that area. During my schooling, through a project done with Wellington County, I worked as a consultant exploring regenerative farming techniques in the area. And this is where I learned more about how agriculture and conservation can work together instead of in opposition. During that experience, I had the opportunity to talk to many local farmers and see the passion and care they have for their land, as well as the benefits to local wildlife that farmland can provide. So since that experience, my eyes were really open to the importance of protecting farmland, which led me to joining the Ontario Farmland Trust this August. I'm just going to pass it over to Martin to introduce himself and give some background on how he came to join OFT.
Thanks, Joel and Megan, and hi, everyone. I'm glad you're all able to join us today. So a bit about myself, I became very passionate about farmland protection at quite a young age, actually. So my family owns a dairy farm that's right along Highway 417, just outside of Arnprior, which is Eastern Ontario for folks who aren't familiar. And at first, I was witnessing the growing number of people using Arnprior more as a bedroom community. It was cheaper land than Ottawa, but yet still had quick access to get into the city. And we started to see less and less people knowing about the rural and agricultural roots of the community. And then more farms were being paved over. So I went to school to study agricultural development, and I worked for the Ontario Agricultural College for about 8 years. And then went back and started my master's in rural planning. I had a very strong interest in community development and needing to balance farmland protection with the growing pressures of development that we see today. And then shortly thereafter, I found my way here to the Ontario Farmland Trust. So I'm able to pursue my passion for supporting the agri-food sector in this province. And again, I'll just say I'm so happy that you're all here with us today to learn a little bit more about the work that the Ontario Farmland Trust does to help protect farmlands and working with landowners one-on-one to achieve that. So I will turn it back over to Joel to kick us off.
Thanks, Martin. So first, we're just going to go a little bit of an overview about what easement agreement is. So farmland easement agreements are tools which give agency to private landowners who want to ensure that their farms remain as farmland forever. Farmland conservation easements provide some of the strongest levels of protection to conserve property for agricultural purposes, and this is made possible through Ontario's Conservation Land Act. When a conservation easement agreement is registered, what's happening is that the rights to conserve the land for agriculture are being donated to the Ontario Farmland Trust, and we hold on to those rights in perpetuity. So landowners will enter these agreements voluntarily and will work with each individual landowner to make sure they are comfortable with the content of the agreement and what restrictions are included to provide necessary protection and conservation objectives of the landowner. These agreements are placed on the title of the property through the Land Registry Office, which is how they remain in perpetuity even after the original easement donor has moved on. This means the Ontario Farmland Trust maintains the conservation rights, and subsequent owners must abide by the agreement how it was originally written by the original donor. Conservation easements are recognized in legislation and are upheld by courts, giving them the strength needed to assure that the landowners that their property will in fact be protected. These agreements do not change land ownership unless the land is being donated to OFT, which is another way we can protect the land. Otherwise, these agreements are simply donating the conservation rights of the property. Because this is seen as a donation and conservation rights have public value, the landowner receives a charitable tax receipt for the appraised value of the easement. It is important to note that these agreements do not give OFT the authority to dictate how the farm operates, and the landowner will remain in control of the farming operation and its practices. So we're just going to go over a little bit of a background of how to start the process. So if landowners are interested in protecting their land with the Ontario Farmland Trust, the best way to do it is to reach out to us directly. So this can be done in a couple different ways. On our website, we have a landowner inquiry form, which allows you to input all of the details of your farm and your protection objectives into it, and then that comes directly to us. If you're not comfortable with that, you can send us an email directly or give us a call, and all of our contact information will be available at the end of the presentation today. From there, staff will follow up to gather information about the property and the vision of the conservation objectives of the landowner. At this time, we will also answer any questions that the landowner might have and delve further into OFT's process for protection. From there, a property profile report is created based on the information we collect from the landowner, so we can assess the alignment of the property and the conservation objectives of the landowner with OFT's program strategy and goals. Once that is done, the potential project must go through approval by our board of directors. So once the project receives approval to go forward, what else is involved? So step one is fundraising. It's important. It's an incredibly important part of the project because the Ontario Farmland Trust is responsible for all costs associated with the conservation easement agreement, apart from the landowner's legal counsel. So we take the financially responsible approach by securing the funding at each stage of the project. So that ensures that the project will continue to go forward. And some landowners may wish to contribute to these costs. However, it's not required to ensure that the project goes forward. But if any costs are donated by the landowner, this is also considered a donation and receives a tax receipt in addition to the other tax receipt from the easement. Landowner conservation objectives can be realized through different strategies. So the entirety of the property can be protected as agricultural, or it can be divided into zones that have different levels of restrictions. And this is all dependent on the landowner's wishes for the property. So if we are to create these different zones, it requires a survey to be done on the property. And we typically use 3 different zones. So zone 1 is the forested and natural area, which typically has the highest land restrictions. Zone 2 is the agriculture, which ensures the land remains in agriculture, and the farmstead area, which includes the farmer's residence, farm building clusters, and other non-agricultural structures on the property, like a woodworking shop, an art studio, etc. However, the farm buildings can also be permitted in the agricultural area if landowners wish to include this in the conservation easement agreement. So you can see on the screen an example of different zones. So the white boundary that you can see represents the agricultural area. The red boundary represents the farmstead area, and the green boundary is the forested and natural area. It's important to note that when you're creating these zones, it doesn't need to exactly reflect the current footprint of the property. So you can see the red zone, which includes the farmstead area, is a little bit larger than where just the buildings are on the property. So this, because these easement agreements are in perpetuity, you may have future goals or future plans for different developments that you might want on, for say, on-farm diversified uses or a woodworking shop, etc. So we can customize this at the time of the agreement to make sure it fits not just your current goals of that year, but the goals that you have for the property and the vision you have for the property. So the next step is drafting the terms of the agreement. So the general purpose of the agreement is to protect the farmland in perpetuity, and OFT has general guidelines that we typically apply to all of our agreements. However, each property is unique, and the conservation easement agreement reflects the uniqueness of both the landowner's wishes and the uniqueness of the property. But Martin will explain more about this in detail later on in the presentation. So once we have the agreement drafted and the zones finalized, an appraiser will determine the conservation rights being donated, the value of that. Typically, the appraiser will determine the fair market value of the property without the easement, and then they determine the fair market value of the property with the restrictions. This process is done by looking at the sale prices of other properties that have similar protections on them. The difference between these two appraised values is what's considered the value of the conservation easement, and a charitable tax receipt for the value is issued to the farmer for that value. Those tax credits can be carried forward up to 5 years, and we encourage landowners to talk to financial advisors and tax consultants who can give them the best advice for their specific financial situation and what would be most beneficial for carrying forward these tax credits. The appraiser has to look for the land's value based on its current designated use, so you will not see an appraisal done based on speculative sale prices. And we typically see an easement valued anywhere between 10 to 17% of the property's fair market value. The Land Registry Office requires a conservation easement agreement, the survey, and a baseline documentation report. So for anyone who's not familiar with that term, this report reflects the state of the property at the time the protection begins. It also becomes a critical tool for the land trust, so we have a record of anything that might appear as a violation at the time of monitoring, but predated the agreement. For instance, if there was an area where a dumping had occurred previously, prior to the registration of the easement, we would want to take note of this so that we don't consider it a violation going forward, and we can ensure no future dumping occurs more than had already been done at the time of the easement being registered. So once the easement is registered, our work doesn't end there. We are then responsible for annual monitoring of the property, which includes site visits by qualified OFT staff to walk the property and ensure no violations occurred or note any changes to the condition of the property. So an example of a condition change that is not considered a violation would be a disease that's killing off trees, but we want to take note of that so we know how the property is changing over the years. Typically, this isn't a problem or a major concern with the landowner who put the easement on the property, but the visits are still important to maintain a record of activity on the property and ensure that OFT is familiar with the property features. Once the property is sold to the next landowner, it becomes all the more critical to have these consistent records and familiarity with the property as we continue the annual monitoring visits. This also creates a great record of the land use and can be added value for any future landowner if they're interested in looking at the property's history and how the property has changed over the years. To ensure OFT is around for as long as our easements, we maintain an investment funds that pays for these monitoring activities. This ensures that OFT is around in perpetuity to continue monitoring and protecting these properties. Something else to mention is the Ecological Gifts Program, which is actually a program offered by the federal government, which provides enhanced tax incentives for landowners wishing to conserve their property. These tax credits can be used for up to 10 years instead of the typical 5 years used for easement agreements, and they are exempt from taxes on capital gains. However, to be eligible for this program, you have to meet the criteria set out by the federal government, which includes a whole bunch of different layers that determines whether they consider the area to be ecologically sensitive. So this can be proximity to other ecologically important areas, species at risk that are found on the property, and a whole variety of others. So if a landowner is interested in pursuing this program, an ecological assessment would be completed on the property by an OFT staff member, and an application would be submitted by OFT on behalf of the landowner to see if it qualifies. So that's a little bit about the Ecological Gifts Program. So now I'll hand it over to Martin to discuss more details of drafting conservation easement agreements.
Great, thanks, Joel. So this is really the bread and butter of the farmland protection piece. So drafting the easement agreement is really an ongoing and iterative process, often beginning with a template agreement as a starting point. So we've infused about 20 years of experience developing these farmland conservation agreements based on the Canadian Land Trust standards and practice, working with landowners, receiving legal advice, and incorporating feedback in each time we work on one of these, so that we know that these agreements are suitable for farmers to support and not hinder agricultural operations, and that they're compliant with the Conservation Land Act and other legal requirements. So we like to provide fair warning as well. Like, these agreements, they do contain a lot of legal language, right? They are legally binding agreements. And so this ensures that OFT has the strength to defend these agreements should they ever be challenged by a future landowner, or if there's any violations that we need to address. We need to keep in mind that the easement refers to the legal restrictions on the property. So we can only enforce these restrictions as they're written and not as how we would interpret their meaning maybe some years later down the road. So this is why we cover a lot of detail in these agreements and like to ask the landowners when we're working with them certain types of situational questions so we can ensure the agreement is developed to meet everyone's expectations and to make sure that they are easily enough. I know I was mentioning legal language, but easily enough to understand the meaning behind the restrictions, and as well for OFT to be able to enforce. So within a conservation easement agreement, covenants and restrictions are defined on the property to protect the land for 999 years. You'll see 3021 here as the example that we have on this draft. So we often say in perpetuity, but 1,000 years is still pretty good and close. I think about as close as we're going to get to perpetuity. So as we mentioned, the exact restrictions can be customized to the landowner's vision, and some standard covenants include particularly identifying within the agricultural area that agriculture uses are permitted at the highest level. And again, we don't tell farmers what to farm or how to, but simply that the land can only be used for agriculture. Otherwise, non-agricultural activities can also be restricted in order to preserve water quantity and quality, preventing severances and subdivision development, restricting types of buildings and development that are non-agriculture, or directing them to locations on the property that protect the greatest amount of farmland. So directing those, for instance, to the farmstead area or along the driveway or road frontage. We're also protecting natural features, such as restricting how many trees can be removed in a year, and restricting non-agricultural commercial uses. We can also prevent the removal of topsoil or aggregate extraction. There's protections that can be provided for lakes and ponds and wetlands, and restricting any sort of dumping. Joel had used that as an example previously as well, preventing that from happening. And there's other opportunities, for example, requiring only native species be planted in the forested and natural areas. Of course, not all native species is what we farm, so agriculture, again, in the agricultural area is fine, but if that's an interest for the forested natural area, then we'll take that approach for that. So I'm adding here a little bit of awareness for folks that this can be a long process. Beginning from initiating the project to the completed registration of the agreement, this can easily take up 1.5 to 2 years to complete. And much of the time is taken up, one, by grant applications and approvals, scheduling surveyors, and booking appraisals, which can often take months at a time. And so noting that also some of these activities have to happen at certain times of the year. For example, the ecological assessment is often best done in the late spring or early summer months. So if we start the process in the winter, we'll be waiting a few months to get those activities started. But while we wait for those activities to take place, we'll get going back and forth, confirming the zones of the property and the details of the agreement. And I want to stress that it's okay on our part that we're taking our time with this, because we want to get it right and ensure that the landowner is satisfied with the levels of protection that we are going to be providing. So when a landowner is thinking about what their conservation interests are, it's important to think about what you are wanting to protect against, which include a variety of threats to agriculture. So easements can protect against threats such as non-agricultural development while still protecting the agricultural land use. They can prevent natural resource extraction from occurring on agricultural lands that would otherwise diminish the quality of the soil, such as aggregate extraction. And it can protect against changing land use policies. So the permitted uses and restrictions from the easement would remain even if a zoning bylaw were to change and allow for other types of activities. So if you see examples of other activities occurring near you and around your property, we'll want to know about it so we can help ensure that your property is protected in a manner in which addresses the concerns and threats that you're witnessing in your area. So while the easement is protecting a particular property, we also like to talk about the ripple effect and other benefits that it has for the agricultural system. So for example, we know through research that farmers are less likely to continue investing in their farm business when they're seeing development creeping closer and closer towards them. But when farmers hear that farms in the area are being protected, this is creating a sense of hope for the preservation of the agricultural system in the region. And farmers can confidently continue investing in their operation. I think this investment is really important for the viability of rural communities, supporting local businesses, and creating more jobs in the agri-food sector. They also are great at preventing land grabbing for speculative buyers who want to convert farmland into development opportunities, thereby keeping farmland more reasonably priced for the next generation of farmers. Conservation easements can also be a tool in farm succession planning, providing assurance to the retiree that the farm will be protected as they hand it off to the next generation. And of course, as communities more and more are looking to mitigate the effects of climate change, preserved farmland will be there to continue supporting carbon sequestration, water absorption, and filtration, and provide habitats for species at risk. So there's a great opportunity to also see these tools from a community perspective as well. I do want to share just a couple of examples of some properties that we have protected in recent years. So the example of a protected property in Prince Edward County was the Hudson Farm, and it was protected in 2020, consisted of 2 properties totaling just over 200 acres. So the Hudsons grow organic hay and heritage grains like rye and red fife wheat and buckwheat. And the property includes 2 areas of natural and scientific interest, as well as home to a variety of species at risk, as you see here on the screen. And those are important because they help support the application to the Ecological Gifts Program. And then this property did qualify for that. This was also one of, well, it was our first property protected within Prince Edward County. And 3 years later, we now have another 2 properties protected in the region, working on a third that should be completed by the end of the year. And we're likely working on another 4 projects within the next year in this area. So all of these properties that I'm talking about, we can actually trace back to the work that we did first with the Hudsons. They became huge advocates of ours, and when news spread out about OFT protecting their property, a growing number of landowners in the region have signed up. Another example that I'll highlight is the Farrows Farm. So this is in Bruce County, and it was protected in 2021, representing a total of over 600, almost 630 acres of protected land. So non-agricultural development had been encroaching on this land, as it has been in so many different regions across the province. And now the development is actually less than 1 kilometer away. And so these 2 parcels that make up the 630 acres also is home to a diversity of agricultural production. As you can see, they produce sheep, row crops, hay, potatoes, and have pasture as well. And so not only is there the diversity of agricultural production, but there's a wide variety of habitat for various species, including the species at risk that you see on the property here. So this significant amount of acreage goes to show that we are able to protect a variety of farm sizes and customize the easements to support all types of agriculture. I wanted to chat a little bit, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, what do we need to consider from a landowner's perspective? So really making OFT aware of your interests. Joel had mentioned the inquiry form that you can find on our website, or reach out to us to initiate a conversation, and we'll certainly dive into some of your questions in a moment. But if anything else comes up, starting that conversation and answering questions is a great place to start. Of course, you want to consider what you want protected. What's driving you to do this, and what agriculture or natural features are important for you to protect. You want to think about any plans for new buildings or changes to the property that might occur in the future. Certainly encourage landowners to always investigate eco-gifts further as well. There's great tax benefits, but it's not necessarily for everyone, nor will every property qualify as well. We also stress this throughout the entire process. And so if you start working with us, you will hear us say this again and again and again, but we want to ensure you have access to legal, accounting, and taxation advice. you want to understand the full implications of the agreement, and everyone's situation is different and unique. And OFT can't be the one that provides any sort of that type of advice. So making sure that you have those resources available to you. Another piece, by the time we get to the end of the project, you're also going to be wanting to make sure that all your property taxes are paid up. And of course, if there is a mortgage that exists still on the property, you'll want to inform us and discuss the plans to protect the property with your lender. If there is a mortgage, a registered postponement would be required, which isn't necessarily a difficult addition to the process, but we do need the lender to agree to that. And there's more information that we can share about that if and when the conversation leads to that moment. That concludes our presentation. We wanted to leave lots of time for questions from the audience, because I think that also comes up quite a bit. So we'll pause there and we'll just take a look at what questions have come in along the way, and feel free to add more as they come.
Thank you, Martin and Joel. Certainly a lot of information to digest there, but you'll notice on your screen now we've got some contact information up there that you can reach out if your questions aren't answered in the next little while. But shall we take a look at the questions?
Okay. I have them up here, Megan, so I'm good if I can. Do you want me just to go ahead and read?
Sure, why don't you go ahead, and we'll just sort of chime in as it works.
Absolutely. So first question is, would it be allowed to take productive farmland and have this naturalized for wildlife habitat? Or are there general guidelines that would see only unproductive agricultural land to move to a natural area? And this is a great question. So we've worked with a number of landowners in the past who did have a vision of having parts of their property that are currently in agriculture renaturalized. And so there are opportunities, for instance, as Joel described, that if they're, when we're in the process of designing the different zones for the property, it doesn't need to be a blueprint of what is currently happening today. So if a farmer is saying that there's a couple acres in the back fields that they want to extend some wildlife habitat or do some wetland restoration or anything along those lines, we can create the zones to permit that within that particular area. And so that's one way of doing it if the restoration of wildlife habitat is going to come after the easement agreement. There's also some clauses in the agreement that, let's say it becomes a point in time where the farm is no longer viable. Maybe we're talking about another 500 years down the road or longer, for various reasons of what might impact that. The farmland itself would be allowed to be renaturalized with the consent of the Ontario Farmland Trust and the current landowner. However, if then in the future agriculture becomes viable again on that particular property, it could always go back into agriculture. So I hope that answers your question, but if there's any follow-ups, please let me know. Joel or Megan, do either of you have anything to add to that?
I think that covers it. Just as you were mentioning about the importance of any future kind of plans or vision for the property when it came to constructing future buildings, future plans for conservation efforts should also be included. And if these are understood at the time that the easement is being constructed, then those things can be incorporated into the zoning.
Yeah, I was just going to echo what Megan said, that it's very important to us that we reflect what the landowner's wishes are for the property. So those are all things that can be negotiated while we're negotiating the kind of drafting the terms of the agreement. And these can be discussed at length to make sure that we get it right the first time, as Martin likes to say, when we're drafting the agreements.
Great. The next question that I have is, we need alternative approaches to ownership and stewardship to support the next generation, address historic inequalities in land ownership, and grow food sustainably. the Rose Land Care Association is trying to figure out how to do this and is very interested in the U.S. Agrarian Trust model that OFT introduced to its members in June. Can you comment? Yes, certainly. And so this is something that OFT has been exploring more and more, and was very honored to have the Agrarian Trust come and give a presentation on how their agrarian commons models work. And that's both with the intention of creating a land base where a collective of farmers can come together and establish businesses, either their own individual farm or establish a cooperative. It's a very exciting model to help create affordable pathways for new and young farmers and those who have historic inequalities of land access to find these pathways into agriculture. And so what the Ontario Farmland Trust has been doing since that time, and since there have been an increased number of inquiries from landowners interested in donating their land to the Farmland Trust, which would make us the landowners of the property, is to explore what different types of models are out there that could work to help facilitate these types of pathways and affordable access to land. And so while those models are still being researched and explored, OFT is very interested in the role that the land trust community can play to help facilitate those sorts of pathways. It is a very exciting model, and there's a lot of important funding in the US that has helped get those types of models established. And so as we continue to think about that here at OFT, we would be looking at developing both the land access program, but also exploring what types of partnerships are available, both in terms of delivering different types of programming that could be delivered on these types of OFT-owned properties, or as well as funding opportunities to help secure these lands. And the important thing to note through that as well is when the land is donated to OFT, it receives the same level of protection as if a conservation easement agreement were on it, since we are the ones who are managing it and creating that framework. If in the event OFT ever needed to dispose of that land for whatever particular reason, an easement would be going on that property first. So if it is back out on the market, we know that that use is still only going to be for agriculture. So there's a lot of different scenarios that need to be played out and need to be conceptualized, but there is an apparent and significant role that land trust can play in helping address exactly what you were asking, Mary. I will also turn it over to Megan and Joel and see if they have anything else to add to that.
I don't have anything further to add. I think your answer is pretty comprehensive.
I agree.
It has been immersed in my life pretty regularly.
I saw that question. I'm like, oh, we're just going to let Martin.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next question is there a pathway to preserve a cultural heritage feature like a ghost town? Interesting, and a lot more challenges behind cultural heritage. Cultural heritage has its own act that is outside of the Conservation Land Act, and we as a conservation organization are recognized to have the authority given to us through the Conservation Land Act. Through the Heritage Act, though, primarily municipalities or the Ontario Heritage Trust are the bodies that are able to do cultural heritage preservation. So it's not really within our scope to be able to address cultural heritage preservation and features that way. But I like where that question is at, where it's heading, because one of the things that folks might recognize in our mission as well is our mission to protect and preserve Ontario's farmland, which includes the agriculture, natural, and cultural landscapes. And so there's a lot of interconnectedness around agriculture, environment, and the social aspects of our communities as well. So great question, but I hope I was able to answer it. Pause to see if anyone else has anything to add to that. Going once, go twice. Okay. Our next question is, do you see OFT being involved with DRAP lands and DRAP is the Duffin Rouge Agricultural Preserve, Lands in Pickering. Now that the Greenbelt designation has been restored, developer still owns the land. What a fantastic question. And very happy to say that we have been very active in our discussions around protecting the draft lands and the Greenbelt lands as well. And so these are significant, about 4,700 acres of prime agricultural land in the Dauphin Rouge Agricultural Preserve that do historically have conservation easements on them that predated the inclusion of agricultural land into the Conservation Land Act. And they certainly have a long and complex history around Pickering had been the easement holders. And they had released those easements. And the province at the time stepped in and said that was not the intent. So we were going to restore these easements and maintain that protection. Since we've seen this back and forth of these lands within the Greenbelt and with these conservation easement agreements, the step one was getting them into the Greenbelt. So there is proposed legislation to do that. And then there's a new Environmental Registry of Ontario posting that's exploring right now reinstating those easements. The Ontario Farmland Trust is providing the recommendation to the government that to help prevent this back and forth of prime agricultural land and the protections that are on it, that the Ontario Farmland Trust be instated as the conservation easement holders, given our 20 years of experience working with these types of agreements and monitoring for their compliance. So we certainly are driving that. We would encourage people to submit comments through the ERO website supporting that. That would be wonderful. And if you have opportunities to express that willingness and desire to either your MPPs or local councillors, particularly if you're in the Pickering region, that would be great. So I hope I answered that question.
And I believe that Tamara has populated the chat with a link to the ERO posting as well.
Great, thanks for doing that, Tamara. Are conservation authorities eligible to participate in the program? Conservation authorities are also seen as a conservation organization that through the Conservation Land Act are able to hold easement agreements. So there is that possibility as well. I'm assuming that's sort of the angle that you're looking at. If there's conservation land that they own that they'd like to have protected, typically it's seen as being protected if they own it. And then if they release it, we would hope that some easements would be put onto those properties. But I can't necessarily speak for the direction that the authorities have in that regards. I know there's been some complexities around changing authority and through the legislation this past year and a bit. So that can be a bit complex, but great question. And yes, they have a role that they can play. I think I've caught up on all of those questions. I can wait a moment to see if anything else comes through. Nothing else. I will be passing this back over to Megan.
All right, thank you, Martin, and thank you to our participants. Those were some good questions. And I appreciate everyone attending today. If you would like to learn more about farmland protection options, please reach out to Joel or Martin, and their emails are up in that PowerPoint slide on your screen right now. And you can also give our office a call. We have more resources that are available on the website, and there is a link that is going to be going into the chat. And I believe that Joel and Martin's contact information is also in the chat already. If you don't have any intranet at home, give them a call, and Joel and Martin will be happy to mail out more information to you. Just let them know your address. And in terms of getting involved with OFT's work. If we sparked some interest with you today, you can remain up to date on our work by following us on your standard social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or by joining to receive our newsletter. You can also consider becoming a member or a donor. And we have a new volunteer program that is set to launch this month. And if you are interested in volunteering with us, please send Tamara an email if you'd like to get involved. There are a bunch of other events also coming up. We have another webinar coming up in January, and another in December. And in March of next year, we will be hosting the Farmland Forum on March 21st in Elora, and it will also be available online. So stay tuned for registration information, which will be available early in the new year. Also, when you're visiting our website, click on that donation tab. Your support helps us to continue our work in farmland protection and to bring these types of events to you. We are a registered charity, so donations over $20 will receive a tax receipt, and we'd really appreciate your involvement that way to help keep our programs going. And thank you all once again.
We'll leave the screen up for just a moment if people need to write down our contact information. But yeah, and thank you, Megan, for your help with today's webinar. It's greatly appreciated. All right, not seeing any other comments coming through except for thanks. Thank you everyone for your thanks. It's always nice and appreciated. We hope you were able to take out a lot of information today, and certainly follow up with us if you have any more questions. And with that, we will be